John McAllister's farm was vast, with wheat fields stretching as far as the eye could see, interrupted only by gentle hills and scattered trees. The man, tall with broad shoulders, seemed as rough as the land he cultivated. His eyes, a cold and distant gray, reflected years of solitude. John's wife had passed away long ago, and since then he had closed himself off in his silent world, governed only by hard work and the demanding tasks that the land required. He wasn't a man of many words, and avoided contact with the few neighbors who still cared to maintain a friendly relationship with him. To John, life was simple. The sun set, he worked, and at the end of the day he retreated to his empty home, with no one to share a meal or the exhaustion of the day with. One day, a letter arrived at his house. The letter, formal in tone, was a job offer for a woman named Emily Johnson, who, according to the correspondence, had been recommended by a longtime friend. She was seeking work as a housekeeper, and the advertisement had been made in a small neighboring town, where, by chance, John knew that the wife of a longtime friend had passed away. Perhaps that was why he impulsively decided to hire her. He wasn't fond of company, let alone housekeepers, but something in that letter and the few words Emily wrote had touched him. She mentioned her search for a new beginning, a chance to build a simple and peaceful life. Something within him recognized that search. The next day, Emily arrived at the farm. She wasn't anything impressive at first glance. A young woman of simple appearance with brown hair tied in a messy bun, wearing simple clothes that showed the effort of someone who didn't care much about appearances. She was different from the women John was used to seeing. She didn't have that artificial glow, nor the forced smile that he saw in the town. Emily had a genuine calmness, and her words were soft but firm. She was greeted without much enthusiasm. John showed her what needed to be done: cleaning the rooms, preparing meals, and, of course, taking care of the large house that seemed to grow emptier by the day. He was direct, almost brusque, but there was no room for unnecessary conversation. Emily didn't seem bothered by his manner. She listened attentively, accepting each task without question. In the first few days, John watched his new employee without saying much, but something inside him began to change, imperceptibly. He didn't know exactly what it was. Perhaps it was the way she moved through the house, with the simplicity of someone who understood the value of hard work, but also with a gentleness that he didn't know how to recognize. While he focused on his work, Emily was always nearby, silently helping, but with a presence that began to fill him, subtly but powerfully. The silence of the farm, which had once been a safe haven for his solitude, began to feel heavy, as if, suddenly, he felt the absence of something more, something he hadn't realized was missing until then. And unintentionally, Emily began to occupy that empty space without making grand gestures, simply by being herself. John, though he didn't realize it, felt a growing discomfort. It wasn't the kind of discomfort that could easily be pointed out, but an internal restlessness that made him wonder, even if just for a moment, if he was getting too used to her presence. But he still wasn't ready to admit that something was changing inside him, something he had never expected to find in that cold and silent house. Life on the farm followed its unchanging routine. The work in the fields, the tasks around the house, and the silence. But little by little, Emily began to become a constant presence in John's life, more than he was willing to admit. She moved through the house with a lightness he didn't understand, as if each step she took was made with a purpose, an intention he couldn't identify. Emily began to familiarize herself with the corners of the farm, understanding the small peculiarities of the place. She knew John preferred not to talk, so in the first few days, she limited herself to silent tasks, with the precision of someone who already knew the hard work. Sometimes, he watched her without saying anything. He didn't feel comfortable asking her about herself, but at the same time, he felt a growing curiosity about her life and what had led her to seek this job. It was on a cold autumn morning, while they were preparing coffee in the kitchen, that the first conversation between the two took place. The wind whistled through the cracks of the window, and the house, inside, felt a little more cozy, with the smell of fresh coffee spreading through the air. John was sitting at the table, his coffee cup in hand, when Emily entered, bringing more warm bread. She placed the bread on the table, and the silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable, but filled with a gentle tension, as if both knew something needed to be said, but neither knew how to start. "Good morning," Emily finally said with a shy smile. John lifted his eyes from the cup and watched her for a moment. He was never one to be gentle with words, but something about her made him lower his guard, even if only a little. "Good morning," he responded briefly, as if he were still getting used to her presence. He wanted to say more, perhaps ask how she was adjusting, but he couldn't. He felt an internal block, as if the words were lost between his mind and his mouth. She sat in the chair across from him, maintaining a respectful distance. She didn't seem to want to force a conversation, but her gaze, warm and curious, was fixed on him, waiting for something. And for some reason, he felt the need to offer some explanation, as if she had already claimed a space he had never allowed anyone to occupy. "How is it that you—" John started, his voice a little rough, as if he were trying to find the right words. "Why did you come to work here? On my farm?" Emily seemed surprised by the question but didn't hesitate. She looked at him with a calm gaze, taking her time before responding. "I was looking for a new beginning," she said. After losing my parents, the city became too small for me. Here I thought I could start over, find peace away from the hustle." John watched her, noticing the sadness in her voice, even though she tried to hide it. It wasn't something he had expected to hear, not even from someone like her with such a serene smile. He had never known how to deal with tragic stories, with lives shaped by loss and pain. He himself had lost much, but he had always kept it to himself. "And you never thought of going back to the city?" he asked, almost as if challenging the idea of a peaceful life there. "The world out there must be very different." Emily gave a slight smile, but her eyes seemed to reflect silent wisdom. "I don't miss the city," she said. "What I miss is the sense of belonging, having a place where I can be myself. Here, the silence, it's welcoming." John felt something strange when he heard that. He didn't know whether it was envy or if, in some way, he too longed for that peace, that feeling she described, but that he had never really known what it was. The conversation was brief, but something had changed that morning. John, without realizing it, felt a weight lift off his shoulders, as if, for the first time in a long time, he had connected with someone, even if it was just for a few minutes. And Emily, with her silent sincerity, seemed to understand him more than he had imagined. As they finished their coffee, silence returned. But it was a different kind of silence. No longer empty, but full of something new, something he still couldn't name. They stood up and returned to their work. But at that moment, John knew that something had begun to change. Not in a visible or clear way, but something inside him had shifted, perhaps irreversibly. In the days that followed, John noticed that his once unchanging routine was beginning to fill with nuances that he couldn't quite identify. Emily, with her serene nature, seemed to have brought with her a calmness that he had never known he needed. She didn't force her presence or her words, but there was something in the way she moved through the farm that seemed to breathe life into it, something he rarely noticed in his own existence. He began to pay more attention to her, to the little things. The way she cared for the animals, how she arranged the tools with precision, the way her eyes lit up the last time she spoke about the sun setting on the horizon, even though he had never shown interest in those small details of life. The simple act of preparing food became a moment of quiet pleasure, something that for him had always been a laborious task devoid of emotion. It was the end of a stuffy afternoon when John was in the field, with the sleeves of his shirt rolled up, pulling dry branches from the fence. The farm began to take on a golden hue with the setting sun. He was so focused that he didn't even notice when Emily appeared in the distance coming from the barn. She carried a bucket of fresh milk, her steps quick and determined. When she approached, John, without thinking, looked at her and gave a small smile. "I brought the milk," she said, her tone soft, but not forcing a conversation. "Thank you," John replied, his voice softer than he expected. He was used to being more distant, even rude at times, but with her the words seemed to flow effortlessly. She watched him for a moment, and before he could return to his work, she asked, "Do you have anything that makes you happy, John?" The question caught him off guard. He looked at her for a moment, as if trying to understand what she was really asking. Emily's expression was calm, but there was a genuine curiosity in her eyes, as if she truly wanted to know. "Happiness?" he repeated, almost laughing at the word, as if it was something he had never really considered. "I have what I need. The farm, the work. That's enough." But as he said that, John realized the word enough didn't sound right. What did he really feel? He had never stopped to reflect on that. Living was something he just did, without questioning. But what did he truly feel? There was something in his voice, a tone of discouragement that he didn't recognize as his own. He looked at Emily, expecting to find judgment in her eyes, but there was none. She watched him with the same calm as always, as if waiting for him to open up. "I don't know," he said finally, his eyes drifting to the field in front of him. "Maybe it's easier this way, to work and not think too much." Emily didn't respond immediately. She simply stood there beside him in no hurry to leave. They stood in silence for a few minutes, with the distant sound of the wind passing through the trees and the rustling of dry leaves around them. It was a comfortable silence, without the tension of the past, without the pressure to find the right words. John finally broke the silence, but it wasn't about happiness. "Do you have something that makes you happy, Emily?" he asked, curious, though his tone seemed less interested than he actually felt. It was an attempt to shift the focus, something to avoid confronting his own weaknesses. She smiled, but with a lightness he hadn't expected. "Yes, the simple fact that I can start over here," she answered without hesitation. "I know I don't have much, but this place is the beginning of something different for me. Something simpler." Her words resonated in his mind. Starting over. He had never thought about the possibility of change the way she did. To John, life was what it was, and people didn't change. They were defined by their pasts, by the choices they made, and by the lives they lived. But Emily seemed to have a different view. She had left her former life behind, coming to this desolate place, not to escape, but to find something. He didn't know exactly what, but something in him felt a deep curiosity, a desire to understand what drove her. "Maybe that's something I've never considered," he said, looking down. "You have courage for that." Emily looked at him, surprised by the word, and then smiled gently. Maybe courage is just the first step. John felt something strange within himself. The word courage, spoken by her with such naturalness, moved him in an unexpected way. Maybe he had never thought of courage the same way. For him, courage was about fighting, resisting, surviving. But for Emily, courage seemed to be about something more: change, acceptance, and above all, the freedom to move forward. The rest of the afternoon passed quietly, but something inside John began to stir. He didn't know exactly what it was, but he felt that something was starting to break within him. What did he really want? What did he feel when he saw Emily, with her calm, tranquil nature and simple way of being, so different from him? He didn't know, but no matter how much he tried to push it away, the truth was drawing nearer. Something was changing, and he didn't know how to stop it. In the days that followed, something shifted in the way John saw Emily. She, who had once seemed an almost invisible presence in his life, was now becoming an important part of his day. He found her in the most unexpected moments, while she was making coffee in the morning, tending to the garden, or organizing things around the house. There was a lightness in her, something he couldn't identify, but that seemed to fill the empty spaces of his existence. Emily wasn't an extravagant woman. Her manner was simple, but she seemed to understand the little things that made the world around her more beautiful. She appreciated the sound of the wind in the trees, the sunset on the horizon, the birds singing at dawn. To John, all of this seemed trivial, things he had never considered. Work was his only concern, and everything else was just background noise in a life of tasks and obligations. But with Emily, the small things began to matter. He realized that even without words, she was teaching him something, to appreciate the moment. He started to see the world differently, though slowly. It was as if in some way the weight of life had begun to feel lighter, even though he didn't yet know how to deal with it. It was on an autumn afternoon, while the wind blew harder, that they found themselves in a more intimate space, away from the weight of daily tasks or the heavy silence that usually inhabited the farm. John was sitting on the porch trying to warm up with a blanket, when Emily approached with a cup of hot tea. She sat beside him, saying nothing, simply offering the cup with a soft smile. He accepted the tea in silence, watching the way she sat calmly, without haste, without tension. It was as if she knew exactly how to be present in that moment, something John had never known how to do. The idea of simply being had never held any meaning for him. It was always about the work, about what was coming next, about what still needed to be done. Emily, on the other hand, seemed unconcerned with time. She appreciated what the present had to offer, and in that moment she offered him the chance to slow down, to simply exist there, in that space. "I've never seen you take a break before," Emily said, her voice gentle but filled with genuine curiosity. John looked at her, unsure of how to respond. He thought about the past few weeks, about how his world seemed to have become lighter, but he still felt strange about it. There was something inside him, a quiet resistance that didn't want to surrender to the simple pleasure of a pause. "I always thought I didn't have time for breaks," he replied, his voice a little softer than usual. "The work has to be done, and there's always something to do." Emily smiled with understanding. "Sometimes, it's not about what needs to be done. It's about what you leave aside to appreciate what is simple. The work isn't going anywhere, John. It will wait for you. But life can pass by without you realizing." Her words echoed in his mind, challenging his deepest beliefs. He had never stopped to think this way. To him, life had always been about responsibility, about fulfilling duties. He had never considered the idea that maybe there was more than just that. As the two of them sat in silence, the afternoon stretched into a calm that John didn't know how to handle. He felt something inside him loosening, something he never knew was tight. The feeling of being at peace, of not having to do anything, was both frightening and comforting at the same time. Emily looked at him, noticing the internal struggle he was facing, and gently asked, "Have you ever thought about taking some time for yourself, John? Not time for work, but time to live?" He looked at her, unsure of how to respond. He had always seen himself as someone destined to work, someone who didn't have permission to stop. And now, standing before Emily, he was beginning to question that. But he didn't know how to change. "I don't know how to do that," he replied, his voice heavy with vulnerability. Emily smiled, her expression calm. "You don't need to know how. You just need to start trying. Sometimes the first step is just to breathe, John, that's it." He sighed deeply, as if those words had stirred something deep inside him. He didn't know if he was ready to change, but at that moment, he felt that maybe it was possible. That night, after the sky darkened and the farm sank into a deep silence, John lay in his bed, staring at the ceiling. He thought about Emily's words, about the small changes that had started happening in his life, and for the first time, he felt a doubt about his old way of living. Something was changing, and even though he didn't know exactly what it was, he felt that he was about to discover it. Whatever it was, he knew he wouldn't be the same anymore. The sun had barely touched the horizon when John got up as usual. The work on the farm never waited, and he had always been accustomed to the rigidity of his morning routine. But something was different. The lightness that Emily brought to his life, though silent, was beginning to seep into his thoughts in a subtle yet powerful way. He didn't know how to handle it. Her words, spoken in the silence of that afternoon, were starting to make more sense than he wanted to admit. Living was a concept he had never really explored, and now he couldn't stop thinking about it. Throughout the morning, while he worked in the field, the sound of the wind in the trees seemed louder. The warmth of the sun on his skin, which before had been just another factor to ignore, now felt warmer, more present. He couldn't help but think about what Emily had said about time and about life. Work would always be important, but what about life outside of it? Was he truly living, or just existing, always running from one task to the next, never stopping to notice what was happening around him. These doubts began to grow within him, and he didn't know how to deal with them. It had never been in his nature to question his choices, but now, everything seemed different. He felt there was something more there, something he hadn't been seeing. While John lost himself in his thoughts, Emily was inside the house arranging the rooms and tending to the daily tasks. She knew that something was changing in him, even if he hadn't fully realized it yet. John, with his rough and distant manner, was difficult to understand, but Emily, with her tranquil nature, could sense he was beginning to open up to something new. She didn't want to force anything, but she could tell he was starting to question the truths he had always believed, and in some way, that made her feel that her presence there was making a difference. She watched him from a distance, saying nothing, but with a subtle smile on her face. She knew he was at a crossroads. The farm, the land, the hard work. All of that was part of his life, but now she began to realize that John, although he had spent so many years building it, was no longer satisfied with just that. He was being called to something more, something he didn't yet fully understand. That evening, after another long day of work, John sat at the table for dinner, as he always did. Emily served the food, and as they ate in silence, John felt a strange sense of discomfort. The food was good, as always. The house was warm with the fire in the hearth, and the atmosphere was cozy, but something was missing. He looked at Emily, who ate calmly, and a thought passed through his mind. She had found something that he still couldn't see. How did she manage to simply live in the moment? How did she seem so at peace? "Emily," he said, his voice lower than usual. She looked at him, surprised but with a soft smile. He never started a conversation like this, especially at night after a day of work when all he wanted was silence. "Yes, John," she replied with her usual calm. He hesitated for a moment, struggling with the words he didn't know how to express. Have you thought about staying here forever?" She looked at him, her eyes gentle as if she were waiting for something more but not rushing to speak. "I've never thought about leaving, John. I'm here because I feel like I've found something that gives me peace." The answer was simple, yet profound. John felt something tighten in his chest. Peace. He had never known what that meant. He thought peace was something that could be bought with work, with accomplishments. But now, hearing Emily's words, he realized that peace was something deeper, something he hadn't found yet. He didn't know what this meant for him, or how he could change, but he felt an increasing need to discover it. Emily, with her simple and tranquil life, seemed to have something he had never known he needed, something he had always ignored but was now starting to desire. He wondered if he could find it too, if he could, one day, be like her, at peace, present in the moment, living instead of just existing. When dinner ended, John retired to his room, but the feeling of restlessness didn't leave him. He lay on his bed staring at the ceiling, lost in his thoughts. Emily was changing his view of the world in ways he didn't know how to comprehend. But he knew that somehow she was opening a door to something new in his life, something he had never sought before but that now felt like an increasing need. And so, as the night deepened and the silence of the farm enveloped him, John wondered for the first time if he was ready to change, if he was willing to leave behind everything he knew, everything he had built, in search of something that might be more important: inner peace. The days began to drag on, and John felt that something was about to happen, although he didn't know exactly what. He could feel it in the air, in the way the sun seemed to shine brighter, as if the universe itself were insisting that he look around and notice what he had ignored until then. The weight of his solitude, which he had always accepted so naturally, was beginning to feel heavier than he had ever imagined. Emily, as always, continued to touch her life with a gentleness he had never expected. She moved through the house, making everything feel lighter, more alive. He was beginning to notice the difference she brought to the environment. The subtle smile when he sat down for coffee, the calm way she organized things, the patience with which she waited for him to open up even with his harsh and awkward words. He didn't know exactly when it began, But at some point he started to want more than what he had known. He felt that something was missing in his life, something Emily seemed to have in abundance, a kind of inner peace, a type of presence he had never experienced. He had never cared much for calmness, always seeing it as a weakness, but now he felt that this calm was, in some way, the key to something more, something he still didn't fully understand. It was a cold November morning when Emily surprised him with a simple question, but one that hit him like an arrow. They were in the garden, John chopping some wood and Emily arranging the flowers she had planted herself. She approached him, her eyes watching his work without hurry but with a quiet interest. "John," she said, her voice soft and curious, "have you ever thought about what you really want from life? What makes you feel like you're truly living?" The question caught him off guard, and he stopped in the middle of his work, the axe blade still lodged in the tree trunk. He looked at her, trying to understand what she meant. He had never stopped to think about something so deep. "I already live enough," he responded, his voice rougher than he intended. "The work needs to be done, and that's what matters." Emily watched him in silence for a moment, her expression still calm. "Is it really just work that matters?" she asked. "Is there nothing else you want for yourself? Something that makes you feel alive beyond obligations?" The question lingered in the air, hanging between them, and John felt his chest tighten. He knew the answer, or at least part of it. Something was missing, something he couldn't name, but at the same time he felt a resistance in accepting this lack. The idea of wanting more seemed pointless to him, a weakness he had never allowed himself. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, more to himself than to Emily. "I'm just a farmer. My life is this. The rest is irrelevant." But Emily didn't seem convinced. She moved closer to him with the same lightness she always had and placed her hand gently on his arm, as if trying to understand something he still couldn't see. "It's not irrelevant, John," she said softly. "You're denying yourself the chance to live, to realize that there's more inside of you. Not just the farmer, but the man you could be. What do you really want, beyond your obligations?" He looked at her, feeling the weight of those words seeping into his chest. He wanted to resist, as he always had, but something was breaking inside him. Emily was right. There was more inside of him, more than he could see. But he feared it. He feared that if he began to seek something beyond work, he would lose control of the one thing that made him feel secure. Routine. He had created this life for himself to avoid the emptiness, and now, that emptiness was starting to become visible. "I don't know what you want from me, Emily," he said, his voice now softer, almost breaking. "I've never thought about it. I never knew how to think about it." She looked at him with an expression of understanding without judging him. "You don't need to know, John. You just need to try listening to yourself, trying to understand what you really want beyond what you think you should do." John fell silent, the weight of her words hanging over him. He knew he was at a crossroads. He was being challenged to look inside himself, to face his own emotions and to consider the possibility of change. But he feared it. He feared losing the only thing he had ever had, the certainty of his work, his routine. Yet something inside him was beginning to stir. A seed was being planted, and despite all the resistance, he knew he couldn't ignore it for much longer. Emily was right. He was denying himself the chance to live. But the real question now was he willing to change? Was he willing to leave behind everything he had always known, to try something that terrified him? As the day drew to a close and the farm prepared for the night, John felt Emily's presence by his side stronger than ever. He knew she was offering him something he had never known he needed, but the fear of losing himself in the unknown still held him captive. He didn't know what he would do, but he knew that somehow his life would never be the same. The doubt was there, but more importantly, the possibility of genuine change was also there. And that night, as he looked out the window, he felt something new, a shy desire for something more, something he could no longer ignore. The night that followed their encounter in the garden was marked by a profound silence, something John was not used to feeling. The house seemed quieter than ever, as if the very space itself was waiting for something, anticipating a change. John lay in his bed, his thoughts spinning like a whirlwind in his mind. Emily's words, simple and direct, continued to echo in his ears. "You're denying yourself the chance to live." He had always seen himself as someone who carried out his duty without questioning. Work was his life, and that was enough. But now, with Emily's presence, he felt something different, something he had never experienced before, an unease. He didn't know if it was a good or bad feeling, but he could no longer ignore it. The doubts that had once been buried under the weight of work were surfacing. The next morning, the routine began as always, but John noticed a difference in himself. He was more attentive, more present. When Emily entered the kitchen, bringing breakfast, John observed her differently. She was no longer just an employee, but a woman who had awakened something inside him, something he hadn't known existed. The simple idea of being with her, of sharing the silence or the small conversations, now seemed to hold a value he had never paid attention to before. "Emily," he said, his voice softer than usual. She turned to him, surprised by the break in their usual silence. "Yes, John?" she asked with a subtle smile, waiting for his next words. He hesitated for a moment but decided he needed to say something. He didn't know exactly what, but he felt he was beginning to perceive a truth he had been avoiding. "I've been thinking about what you said, about living, not just working." He stepped away from the table, his mind still processing what he was trying to express. I don't know how to live differently, Emily. I've always done things the way I thought I should, but now I see that maybe I've missed something along the way." Emily watched him attentively as if waiting for him to open up further. She knew he was starting to see things in a new light, and the mere fact that he admitted it was already a big step. "You're not alone in this, John," she said gently. "Change doesn't happen all at once. It starts slow, with small steps. And it's not about leaving everything behind, but about finding balance." Her words were like a balm to his soul, a silent understanding that he didn't have to abandon his life but could shape it in a way that felt more true. He was beginning to understand that work didn't have to be his only purpose. He had lost sight of what it truly meant to live, and now with Emily, he had the chance to rediscover himself. "I want to try," he said, finally looking her in the eyes. "Try something different. Something more." Emily smiled with a glint of satisfaction in her eyes. "I'm here, John. You don't have to try everything at once. Just begin. And if you need help, I'll be by your side." Those simple words, but so full of meaning, were exactly what he needed to hear. He knew that the journey he was about to begin wouldn't be easy, but he also knew he wasn't alone anymore. For John, the idea of beginning to change scared him, but at the same time, he felt that it was the only thing that could bring him the true peace he had been seeking. The rest of the day passed slowly, but what had happened that morning still lingered in his mind. That night, when he retired to his room, he lay down with a heart lighter than usual. He knew the journey would be long and full of obstacles, but for the first time, he felt that he was on the right path. He had taken the first step. When Emily entered the room, after finishing the last of her tasks, John looked at her and said with more sincerity than ever, "Thank you, Emily, for making me see something I didn't know I was missing." She simply smiled softly and replied, "You're already on your way, John. You just need to keep walking." That night, when the sound of the wind howled outside and the house was silent, John closed his eyes with a sense of hope. He knew there was still much to learn, but he also knew that the greatest challenge had already been overcome. He had allowed himself to change. He had taken the first step. And with Emily by his side, he felt that perhaps it was possible to live in a way he had never imagined. The dawn would bring new challenges, but for the first time in a long time, John felt ready to face them. The change that John felt starting to unfold in his life wasn't something grand, but it was real. Every day he tried to practice what Emily had shown him, the idea of being present in the moment, of living in a more conscious way, without the constant pressure of work, responsibility, and solitude. It was hard. There were days when it felt like he was fighting against his own instincts, but with every small step, he felt he was getting closer to something bigger. Emily, with her unwavering patience, never pressured him. She was there offering her company and advice when he sought it, but never forcing anything. She knew that the deepest changes come when least expected, and she was right. As the days went by, John began to realize that there was more to him than just the land and hard work. One morning, while working in the fields, John noticed that something was different. The field, the wind touching his face, the distant sounds of grazing animals, everything seemed more vivid, clearer. He didn't know exactly how, but it felt like he was living in a deeper way. He was allowing himself to feel things more intensely, more genuinely. The work, which before had been just an obligation, now became an opportunity to connect with the land, with what he had built over the years. He was beginning to understand that, although work was an important part of his life, it didn't need to be the only thing that defined him. Emily, in turn, continued to surprise him with the way she was. She didn't demand anything from him, nor did she expect him to change overnight. She simply offered what she had best: her simplicity, her sincerity, and her ability to see beauty in the little things. It was during these moments of simplicity that John began to understand that there was a freedom in living without hurry, without the constant pressure to accomplish, to achieve. True freedom lay in being able to simply be. One Sunday afternoon, while they were in the garden, Emily suggested something unexpected. "John, how about we go into the city?" she asked, her voice light, as if it were the simplest thing in the world. "I have some things I need to buy, and I thought it might be good for both of us to take a trip, see some other people. I think you could use a break too." John looked at her surprised. He rarely left the farm, and the idea of going to the city seemed like a futile effort. He was used to his solitude, to the routine that gave him control. But seeing Emily's smile, something inside him made him say yes. "All right," he replied hesitantly but with a spark of curiosity in his eyes. "Let's go." The journey to the city was longer than he expected. During the trip, the ox-drawn cart that John used swayed gently as he looked at the fields around him, feeling the vastness of the world around him. He rarely saw other people, and the idea of being in a place full of life made him feel a little uncomfortable. But Emily, as always, was calm, serene, and seemed to carry a peace that he was still searching for. She spoke about little things, like the changing seasons and what she could buy for the house, making the trip more bearable, more enjoyable. Arriving in the city, John was overwhelmed by the hustle and bustle. The streets were full of people, cars, and sounds, something he hadn't experienced in a long time. But instead of feeling displaced or irritated, as he would have normally, he felt a strange sense of curiosity. The shops, people chatting on the sidewalks, the sound of children playing. Everything seemed so alive. It was as if he had stepped into a world he had always ignored. Emily led him through the streets with ease, smiling and greeting everyone around her. She knew the people, and unlike John, she seemed comfortable in that environment. He watched closely, more interested in the way she interacted with the world than in the city itself. He saw in her an ease of living, a quiet confidence he longed for. She wasn't just in the city, she was part of it. And for the first time, John felt like he wasn't part of anything. He felt like a spectator of his own life. When they reached a small grocery store, Emily went to the shelf to grab some items while John stood by the door, observing. People passed by him, some greeting him, others ignoring his presence. He felt a slight discomfort, but at the same time, something inside him started to stir. He didn't need to be chained to this farm, to this solitude. He could somehow find a balance between work and the world beyond his door. While Emily paid for the groceries, John approached the store's window and looked at the sky. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in golden and orange hues. He felt a quiet peace settle in his heart. He knew that this peace didn't come from work or the farm, but from something inside him. Something he was starting to understand that he needed to cultivate, something he had ignored for so long. On the way back to the farm, John felt a different lightness. He was beginning to realize that freedom wasn't about escaping what he knew. but about allowing himself to experience what the world had to offer, about allowing himself to feel life in its entirety. And perhaps, for the first time, he felt ready for that freedom. When they got home, Emily looked at him with a gentle smile. "See how big the world is?" she asked, her voice soft. "There's so much more to discover, John, and you've already taken the first step." John looked at her, a shy smile appearing on his lips. "Yes, I see, and maybe I'm ready to discover more." And so, that night, in the silence of the evening, something within him aligned. He knew there was still much to learn, but for the first time he felt like he was walking in the right direction. The weight of solitude, which had once kept him bound, began to disappear, making room for something new. Something he didn't exactly know what was, but that he was willing to explore. In the days following the trip to the city, John continued to work on the farm, but something inside him had changed. The lightness of the experience, the simple act of stepping out of his routine, the contact with people in the world beyond the farm, was still fresh in his mind. He didn't know how, but he felt that his life was heading in a different direction, one he didn't know how to control. As he rode across the fields that morning, the cold wind cut against his face. But even with the biting breeze, he felt a strange warmth in his chest. The change wasn't visible, but he could feel it. It was as if the walls he had built over the years were slowly crumbling, revealing a world he had ignored for so long. However, along with this new sense of freedom, there was also a weight. He couldn't shake the growing feeling of doubt, a storm brewing inside him. The idea of living differently, of changing, seemed both liberating and terrifying. He feared losing everything he had always known, worried that change would lead him to a place where he couldn't recognize himself anymore. Emily, as always, was present, calm and silent. She seemed to understand his feelings without him needing to express them in words. She saw the internal struggle he was facing, but never pressured him to speak. She was there, with her tranquil presence, like an anchor amidst the storm he was experiencing. It was on a stormy night when the conversation finally happened. They were in the living room, the fire crackling in the hearth gently lighting the room. Emily sat in the chair reading a book, and John was at the table, fiddling with some farm notes. But his thoughts were far away, drifting on issues he couldn't resolve alone. "Emily," he said, his voice a little deeper than usual, "I don't know what's happening to me." She lifted her eyes from the book and looked at him attentively. She knew he was trying to put into words something he had avoided speaking about for a long time. She set the book aside, giving him her full attention. "I'm starting to feel different," he continued, his voice laden with confusion. "I don't know if it's good or bad. I don't know how to handle it. I always thought life was about work, about what I had to do to survive. But now, everything feels uncertain, and that scares me." Emily got up from her chair and approached him without hurry, as always. She didn't say anything right away, just sat beside him, offering her silent company. She knew that for John, talking about his feelings was a challenge, but she also knew that he needed this freedom, just as much as he needed her presence. "I understand, John," she said softly but firmly. "Changing is scary. Stepping out of your comfort zone, it's hard, but you're not alone in this. You can take these steps, one at a time. You don't have to rush. You have time." John looked at her, feeling something new in his chest. He felt the calm she brought, but also felt he couldn't keep hiding behind his solitude anymore. He couldn't keep living his life just as a farmer, a man marked by his tasks and his fears. He needed to allow himself to be more, to explore the possibilities that life had to offer. "I'm afraid of losing everything I've built," he confessed, the words finally spilling from his mouth like a weight he hadn't known he was carrying. "The work, the farm, everything I've done so far. What happens if I change? What happens if I fail?" Emily looked at him, her eyes deep and filled with silent understanding. "You won't fail, John. Life isn't about not making mistakes, but about learning from them. And, more importantly, about living in a way that makes you feel whole. You have to allow yourself to be more than the farmer. You're a man, with feelings, with desires, with dreams. It's not too late to start living. Her words penetrated deep into his heart, like a ray of light illuminating a dark path. He allowed himself to breathe, feeling the weight of her words and the truth in them. The life of work and solitude that he had built over the years was no longer enough. There was something more he desired, something he didn't know how to seek, but that now, for the first time, he believed was possible. "I want to try," he said, his voice firmer now. "I don't know how, but I want to try. I want to learn how to live." Emily smiled, a look of understanding and support on her face. "That's the first step, John, and it's the most important one. Now you know what you want. The rest will come with time." The rain outside grew heavier, but inside the house a quiet stillness took over. John knew that the journey he was about to begin wouldn't be easy. He didn't know what the future held, but something inside him was changing, and for the first time in a long time, he felt he was on the right path, even though he didn't yet know where it would lead. The fear, which had controlled him for so long, was beginning to lose its power. With Emily by his side, he felt stronger. She had shown him that there was life beyond work, a life full of possibilities. He still didn't know exactly how to live, but he was ready to begin learning. He knew the change wouldn't be easy, but now, he was willing to take the necessary steps, one at a time. And so, that rainy night, the weight he had been carrying began to dissipate, and he felt freer than ever. The first step had been taken, and with it the promise of a new life, full of possibilities, was within his reach. The dawn brought a gentle breeze that caressed the farm, the sound of birds chirping in the distance, the silent and vast field stretching before John like a blank canvas. He woke with a different feeling, lighter, as if he had finally awakened from a long sleep. He had taken the first step toward change, and although the journey would be long, he knew he could not turn back. That morning, Emily wasn't in the kitchen as usual. John, curious, stepped outside and found her in the garden, tending to the flowers she had planted herself, her delicate hands working carefully but also with a confidence that he admired. He watched her for a moment without approaching, feeling the weight of their last conversation still echoing in his mind. He wanted to speak, but something made him hesitate. What more would he have to say? The words seemed too small for what he felt. Emily, sensing his presence, looked up and smiled when she saw him standing there watching her. "Good morning, John," she said with the lightness she always had, as if nothing had changed. "Good morning," he replied, his voice softer, more open. There was something in his eyes that she immediately noticed. He was different, in a way that she knew wasn't just external but internal as well. "I was thinking about something," he began, his toes shifting in the dirt beneath his boots. "I never thought life could be more than this. Work, routine, duty. But now, after everything, I realize there might be more that I've been missing. I never knew how to live any other way." Emily watched him closely, but didn't interrupt. She knew he was opening up, and that alone was a big step. "It's normal to be afraid of the unknown, John, but life is made of that. Learning, growing, allowing yourself to change. I feel like I'm starting to see something I've never seen before," he said with a thoughtful expression. "You've shown me something I didn't know I needed. I'm not saying it's easy, but now, I feel like there's something more, something I want to live for." She smiled, a smile that came from a deep place, from someone who knew exactly what it was like to discover one's own truth. "You're ready, John, and that's the first step to living." John moved closer to her, his gaze fixed on the ground for a moment before finally meeting her eyes. "I've thought a lot about what you said. It's not about leaving everything behind, but about living in a way that's real, not just working to exhaustion. I want to be more than this." Emily extended her hand to him, gently touching his hand as if wanting to guide him closer to herself, without words, just with her touch. You already are more than this, John. You just need to believe it. He felt something there, in her touch. It was as if he had been blind for so long, trapped in his own idea of who he should be, but now, looking at her, he understood. He could be more. He could allow himself to be more. I want to try, Emily, he said, his voice firmer now, more confident. I want to try living in a way that's not just about work. I want to discover what else life has to offer. I know you do, John, she replied with a softness that made him feel as though she was telling him everything would be all right. And with time, you'll find that balance. It's not about changing everything at once. It's about taking one step at a time. Over the days that followed, John continued to experiment with this new way of living. He allowed himself to spend more time with Emily, talking about simple things, sharing thoughts he had never shared with anyone. He learned to slow down, to savor the moments of calm and beauty that were around him. He began to appreciate the sunrise, the colors the sky took on, the song of the birds. He started to live. But even as he opened himself to life in a new way, there were still challenges. The work on the farm never ceased to be hard, and the responsibility he had over the land never disappeared. But now, he no longer saw work as the only reason for his existence. He saw work as a part of his life, but not the center of it all. On one particularly cold morning, while he was outside inspecting the fields, Emily approached him with a basket of fresh fruit. She watched him from a distance for a moment, seeing how he seemed more relaxed, more at peace. He turned toward her, a genuine smile on his face. I never thought I could feel this, he said, his voice filled with emotion. But when you told me to start living, I didn't know what that meant. Now I know, and everything is clearer. Emily smiled, and with a tenderness she always carried, replied, You did it, John. It wasn't easy, but you did it. John looked at her, with a look that reflected a silent truth. He was no longer alone, and more importantly, he wasn't hiding from life anymore. He had taken the step toward change, and with it, he had found freedom. I don't know where this will lead me, Emily, he said, but I'm ready to find out. And I want you to be here, by my side, to live it with me. She looked at him, her eyes shining with a soft smile. I will be, John, always. And so, as the sun set on the horizon, bringing a new day, John knew that true change had already begun inside of him. He was ready to live, and he was ready to discover what else life had to offer. And with Emily by his side, he didn't fear the future. He knew that now he had the courage to face it.